So, good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's armchair travel session. If you haven't seen my face already at previous events, my name is Kate Suarez, and I look after the travel programme at the University of Oxford. And I'm also joined online by Claire Baxter, who looks after the travel programme at Cambridge. So today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Mike Searle and Professor David Gellner from the University of Oxford. And this dynamic duo are going to take us on a virtual experience to Nepal this evening. At the end of the session, there will be the opportunity to ask questions and answers, to ask questions which will be answered. And you can do this via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And just a little reminder that the session tonight is being recorded. So if you are avid attendees of these armchair travel events, you'll be pleased to know that we nearly have a programme for the rest of the year on a monthly basis. And upcoming events include destinations of India, Oman, and the Buddhist art and culture of the Himalayas. So keep your eyes peeled for these coming up soon. So I'm very pleased that Indus Experiences are hosting tonight's event. Indus Experiences work together with us on the alumni travel programme, organising trips predominantly to India and Asia. So before we hand over to Mike and David, I would like to introduce you to Asya from Indus Experiences, who will just say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm really excited and I can't wait to listen to Mike and David. So very briefly, just like to take a moment and introduce myself. I'm Asya. I'm from Indus Experiences, where I look after marketing. We are a very boutique, very niche tour operator based in London, and we specialize in creating tailor-made travel to Asia. We've been very fortunate that we're working with Oxford and Cambridge alumni programs for the last 4 to 5 years, I believe now. We've covered a lot of topics, which have included obviously geology, architecture, astronomy, to name a few. Mike and David are going to be talking to us today about the Himalaya of Nepal, geology of the Himalayas. I beg your pardon. Where they are going to be talking us through today, the tour that we will be running in on the alumni program is taking place in September 2021 this year. We have more planned, the walks in the Himalayas, which is planned for, I think, 2022, and another one focused on Moorish architecture, which is yet to be decided. All the details will be launched and will be available, and Oxford and Cambridge will send out information, so do keep your eyes on that, as Kate said. And I won't take any more of your time today. I will now hand it over to Mike, who I believe is going first. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody see the screen okay?
Good.
Yep. Okay, well, very warm welcome to everyone. What we're going to talk about today is a trip that we're going to run hopefully in late September, October to Nepal, and specifically trekking in the Mustang area. This will be the second trip I've run with Indus Experience. We had a previous one up to Annapurna base camp along the Modi Kola several years ago. So I will start off with 20 minutes or so of talking about the geology and end up with some words on the earthquake. And then I will hand over to David Gellner, who will be talking about the culture, religion, and politics of Nepal after that. Okay, so here is Nepal, as I'm sure anybody who's been there will know, is an absolutely wonderful country. You fall in love with it at first sight. It has the most fantastic scenery, most incredible mountains, beautiful hill villages, and the people are absolutely delightful. I first went there in 1980, and I've been going back pretty much every year since. So my excuse for keep on returning to Nepal has been geology. I'm a research geologist in Oxford University, and I've been researching along the Himalayas in regions Zanskar, Ladakh, as well as the Karakoram in Pakistan and Nepal for about 30 years now. And the last 10 years, I've been concentrating really in the Annapurna Dhaulagiri range in this region here. And the Gandaki is this incredible valley that truncates right the way through from the Tibetan plateau all the way down to the plains of India eventually. And where it cuts through the Himalayas, it cuts through two 8,000 meter peaks, Dhaulagiri and Annapurna. And it is one of the most spectacular transects of the Himalayas you'll see anywhere. So just to put you in the picture geologically, India, the Himalayas are part of the Indian plate. India started life off about 120 million years ago, attached to Southern Africa, Madagascar, and Antarctica. It split away the great continent, supercontinent of Gondwana. Gondwana rifted away about 120 million years ago. India became an island, and it traveled very rapidly across the Indian Ocean to collide with Asia, roughly at equatorial latitudes about 50 million years ago. The trace of that suture zone, the zone of collision, is this black line that runs right along southern Tibet. We call it the Indus suture zone because it follows the track of the Indus River through southwestern Tibet. And so the Himalayas are entirely part of the Indian plate. To the north of that is the largest uplifted plateau we see anywhere on the planet, the Tibetan Plateau, which has double thickness crust, about 80 kilometers thick. And it's got an average elevation of just over 5 kilometers above sea level. So the Himalayas can be divided into three major ranges. The northern one, the Kingdom of Mustang, which is where we're going, is in this region of the Upper Gandaki. And that is part of the upper crust of the Indian plate. It's what we call the Tethian Himalaya. It's a series of sedimentary rocks that range from Cambrian about 500 million years ago up to Eocene about 50 million years ago, which is when the two plates collided. Spectacular folds and thrusts indicate that this zone here has been shortened by 200 or 300 kilometers at least. The highest peaks of the Himalayas in this snow, this is a picture from the space shuttle, which comes in to the Earth's atmosphere upside down, which is why you see the tail fin of the space shuttle here. And it's roughly taken over Kathmandu looking west all the way to the Karakoram. Ladakh is over here. So the high peaks of the Himalayas, these snow-capped peaks here, are all mostly the metamorphic rocks, the deep crustal rocks that were part of the Indian plate and have been buried to higher pressures and temperatures, metamorphosed, and then thrust out to the surface along these major thrust faults that we see. The main central thrust, which was active during the Metamorphism, and the main boundary thrust, which is the seismically active thrust fault that we see today along the southern boundary of the Himalayas. So the main boundary thrust is the one where all the earthquakes rattle off. The Gorkha earthquake went off in this region here, underneath the high Himalayas, and what it should have done was propagate up to the surface. I'll go on to talk about that a little bit more at the end. So the Mustang region is in this region here of the upper crust, which is all sedimentary rocks, spectacularly folded and thrust, and all of the high peaks here south of the Annapurna Dhaulagiri region are all the metamorphic part. A cross-section of the Himalayas, this is actually through Kathmandu and the Ganesh Himalayas, shows the part of the fault that ruptured during the Gorkha earthquake here. And at the top of the Himalayas, this region here, is all the metamorphic rocks that culminate with the major leucogranites. And many of you will know that some of the highest peaks of the Himalayas, mountains like Manaslu and Makalu and the lower part of Everest, are made of these 20 million year old Miocene leucogranites. So here's a few of the spectacular mountains around the Annapurna region. This is the south face of Annapurna, which was one of the 8,000 meter peaks, the first one to be climbed, in fact. Dhaulagiri over here on the right, the magnificent, this is just below 7,000 meters, but this is the magnificent holy mountain of Mashapuchari, the fishtail, taken from the Sarangot Ridge right above Pokhara. So on our trip, we will fly from Pokhara to Jomasam, going along the Gandaki gorge. So we'll be flying about 2,000 or 3,000 meters lower than the summits of Dhaulagiri and Annapurna, and you'll get magnificent views of the ice falls coming off each of those faces. We land at Jomasam Airport, which is here on the northern side. We won't be going in planes like this. This was taken during a filming trip with the BBC. Ian Stewart was in this plane. I was in a helicopter, and we were flying around the Annapurna Sanctuary to present some of the BBC programs there. So the metamorphism of the Himalayas is all this colored sequence of rocks here. This is the classic view taken from Poon Hill, very famous trekking route, looking across the deep gorge of the Gandaki, which is down here, to Dhaulagiri. And Dhaulagiri and Annapurna are two of the only peaks, the 8,000 meter peaks, which are actually in the base of the Tethian sequence. So these are sedimentary rocks. Dhaulagiri is Cambrian and Ordovician limestones and dolomites, spectacularly folded, and all of the colored rocks here are the metamorphosed equivalents of the Tethian, which we will see further down towards Pokhara. So the metamorphic sequence here can be matched to the unmetamorphosed upper crust sequence of the Tethian zone here, which, as I say, range from Cambrian, even Precambrian sediments at the base, all the way up to the Cretaceous. And this is the classic shelf carbonate sequences you see everywhere on the Gondwana plates, in the Alps, in the Zagros Mountains, in Oman, and on the northern side of the Indian plate. Geological map of the Annapurna region, which I won't go into here. Dhaulagiri is this region here, and Annapurna is this region here. And all of these rocks are the metamorphic part of the Greater Himalayas. And as we go north from Jomasan, we go in towards Kagbeni, and Lomantang is at the northern end of that. So the most incredible thing geologically about the high Himalayas is that the whole metamorphic sequence along 2,500 kilometers of the high Himalayas is actually upside down. When you trek northwards towards Tibet, you're going progressively into higher and higher grade rocks. Biotite, garnet, kyanite, sillimanite is going up the Barrovian metamorphic sequence, and eventually you get into migmatitic rocks like this, where the granites are actually melting from. So on another filming trip, I managed to persuade the company to hire an aeroplane and to film the south face of Dhaulagiri, because what we were interested in are these spectacular low angle normal faults. This is the base of the Tethian carbonate sequence, Cambrian and the Ordovician limestones. And these are incredibly high grade rocks formed at depths of about 35 to 45 kilometers depth and brought up by thrusting after the Indian plate collision. So in the Annapurna region, it's very famous for these spectacular folds, huge, large-scale folds, mountain-scale folds, which we see most spectacularly in the mountain of the Nilgiri peaks, which are just south of Jomasan. And this mountain here, this is all Ordovician Cambrian limestone, recumbently folded, and it is this mountain here. This is just above the village of Marfa in the Gandaki, which is a beautiful little village. Used to be on the main circuit round Annapurna before they built the road down there now. And looking across to the Nilgiri peaks, you see these spectacular folds in the Ordovician limestones. These are the small scale structures that you see on the cliffs above Marfa. And then in the Jomasan region, from Dhaulagiri northwards all the way towards Jomasan and Mustang, the same rocks, these are the Cambrian, Ordovician, Paleozoic, Mesozoic sediments, all spectacularly folded. So this picture here is taken above Jomasan. There is the airstrip. This is where the planes land. You can see it's in a spectacular setting with 8,000 meter peaks to the south, Dhaulagiri and Annapurna, and these great folds in the Tethian shelf carbonate sequence. Well, north of Jomasan, the whole story changes dramatically. When you go past the village of Kagbeni, you're into what we call the Mustang Lake. And during the rise of the Himalayas between 30 and 20 million years ago, the Himalayas probably reached its maximum elevation approximately 20 million years ago. The rise of the Himalayas dammed the rivers that were flowing off the Tibetan plateau. Tibet was already high, drainage was flowing south, and the rivers were dammed by the rapidly rising Himalayas. And in the Gandaki, it built up this lake that stretches for nearly 100 kilometers north into Tibet. Lomantang is in this region here, and you can see that the rocks are all these very pale white, barely consolidated lake sediments. So at some stage, we don't know exactly when, but probably about 1 million years ago, the river dammed through, burst through the high Himalayas, at this region here near Kagbeni, and the entire lake, about 100 kilometers long, 20 kilometers wide, flooded right the way through the Gandaki gorge all the way down to the plains of India. It's a bit like pulling the plug out of a bath and having all the bath water flood through your kitchen to the front door. It was one of the most spectacular such events that have occurred throughout the Himalayan history. And you can see this happening everywhere in Pakistan, India, Nepal, Arunachal Pradesh. So these lake sediments, the Gandaki River has cut through these lake sediments, and we will be trekking up this region to Lomantang, the capital of the Kingdom of Mustang, through these lake sediments. Now, I have not been to Mustang before, but a very good friend of ours, General Sir Sam Cowan, who I'm sure is listening to this, who lives in Oxford. Here are the three of us meeting up for our regular Nepali chat in the Rose and Crown pub in Oxford, which unfortunately we haven't been able to do for the last year, but we will do as soon as they open. Sam has spent more time in Nepal. He was the commander of the Gurkha regiment there for many years. He's been going to Nepal forever and knows the country like the back of his hand better than anyone. And all these pictures of Mustang are taken from Sam. So you can see that the lake sediments are these very well stratified sediments here, and the Mesozoic shelf carbonates are behind them in this region here. Mustang is a land full of monasteries and gompas and spectacular old Tibetan type villages at Lomantang and all the way to the south. This is the type of trekking that we will be doing, fairly gentle trekking each day between lodges with jeeps and ponies carrying the gear behind us. This is the village of Kagbeni, which is roughly where the Gandaki broke through the high Himalayas to drain the lake. The peak of Nilgiri looking south down here. And this is the capital, Lomantang, the capital of Mustang. So these are the spectacularly preserved quaternary lake sediments that occur above Lomantang. And this is where we'll see a lot of these monasteries and monk settlements that are drilled into caves in these rocks above the cliffs here. So this is not the first time it's happened, and the most recent time it's happened was actually in May 2012 when I was doing my geological work in the Gandaki, and we heard rumors that there was an enormous avalanche in Pokhara. So we hot-tailed it back to Pokhara and discovered that the entire west face of Annapurna 4 had collapsed. All of this mountain here had collapsed into one enormous great landslide debris that again dammed the Seti River. The Seti River is much smaller than the Gandaki, but it had exactly the same effect. A lake built up behind it, and eventually the lake dam burst. So when Annapurna 4 west face collapsed, a friend of mine who is a pilot, a Russian pilot working for the Avia Club in Pokhara, just amazingly happened to be flying over the Seti Kola with a couple of tourists when it happened. This picture is taken from the camera on his wing tip, and he of course radioed straight back to Pokhara, but was not in time to get word out to the local villages at the top of the Seti Kola. So what happened was that the lake built up with all of this drainage area between Mashapuchari, Annapurna, all the way around to Annapurna 4, and when the water pressure got too much, it burst down the Seti River. This picture here was taken on the 21st of May as the flood came down. And this picture was about a week later. And you can see that only the top rung of this village survived. All of these houses were swept away, and the flood went all the way down to Pokhara town, where it had a devastating effect on the drinking water supply. All of this debris here was derived from the avalanche on the west face of Annapurna 4, came all the way down the Seti Kola. So to finish, I'm just going to say a few words about the Gorkha earthquake. This happened on the 25th of April 2015. And again, I was due out to Nepal the week after this. And I got message back from our Sherpas, our Gorkha helpers who live in the village of Yasa, just in the east side of the Gandaki. Don't come, don't come. Nepal's catastrophe, everything's fallen and wrecked. And it was a disaster for the country. It was a magnitude 7.8 earthquake. Epicenter was about 15 kilometers depth, and it was a thrust fault. During that earthquake, the horizontal slip, the rocks above that fault moved by anything up to 7 meters in the matter of a few seconds. The fault ruptured about 150 kilometers of the plate boundary from Gorkha all the way eastwards towards Mount Everest. The mountains on the north side of Kathmandu rose by just over 1 meter in about 3 seconds. So all of this mountain range to the north of Kathmandu, this shows the maximum uplift of the mountains to the north of the Kathmandu Valley. The big problem is that we know that this is the segment of the fault that ruptured to make the earthquake. And this is where all the devastation and the uplift occurred. What should have happened is that the energy should have been released in these thrust faults that bound the southern margin of the Himalayas. But in this case, it didn't. So the epicenter was here, just to the north of Gorkha, right beneath 2 villages, Laprak and Barpak, that were almost 100% destroyed. Large villages, completely flattened, hundreds of deaths. The village where our people lived is on the opposite side of the Gandaki, Yasa, that was about 50% destroyed. 2 weeks after the Gorkha earthquake, another massive great earthquake occurred in the region just south and west of Everest. This was called an aftershock, but it was actually a 7.3 magnitude earthquake, which was enormous. And this is the one that did a lot of damage to places in Kathmandu and in the Langtang region here. So for, let me skip that. What should have happened during that earthquake is that the faults should have ruptured all the way to the surface along the southern slopes of the Himalayas down near Chitwan. And these are the kind of structures that were produced during the Great Assam earthquake of 1934, sorry, the Bihar earthquake. And nothing like that happened in Gorkha. So we know from huge earthquakes in Western Nepal, 1505, and a huge earthquake in Eastern Nepal, 1934, that these areas, the north-south strain taken up by the northward motion of India, is largely taken up. The Gorkha earthquake only managed to take up strain in this area here. This is where all the earthquakes, and the epicenter was in Gorkha and the ones to the south and west of Everest. Unfortunately, the areas that are in mortal damage now of future ruptures are the areas south of Kathmandu and the area to the west of Gorkha, including Pokhara and up to the Gandaki gorge here. This earthquake could happen at any time. We know it's going to happen. We don't know if it's going to happen tomorrow or in 10 years' time or in 100 years' time, but at one of these days it will happen. It's absolutely inevitable. So not only did the earthquake have this devastating effects on the topography in Kathmandu and the mountains to the north, but it also had huge effects in the village of Langtang Lurum. The very first time I went to Nepal in 1980, we went to climb the south face of Langtang Lurum. We didn't get to the summit, we got to somewhere up here. And we spent a month camping outside the village of Langtang, which is an absolutely idyllic, beautiful Himalayan Nepali village. After the earthquake, the village completely disappeared. It was totally buried by rock and ice and rubble coming down as a result of the earthquake. And the entire climbing route, which went up here, is now destroyed. It's all in rubble that went here and buried the entire village. No survivors at all. The houses, 3-story houses buried beyond the roof. It was an absolute catastrophe. This was a picture taken from our Camp 1, looking straight down where the avalanche went. Langtang village is right down at the bottom of the valley. There's snow and ice avalanches all the time in the Himalayas, but the Langtang one was a massive rock fall. Rock and ice avalanches are the worst of all because they actually bury whole villages, as we've seen. This is looking from Langtang up towards the Jugal Himalaya. It was the same time, the same earthquake which affected Everest Base Camp. There's about 100 tents in here, Everest Base Camp, and the entire Searle region on the west ridge of Everest collapsed and caused this air blast to run right through Everest Base Camp. And something like 15 people were killed during that event alone. So earthquakes are very prominent. We're bound to feel them. They rattle off all the time in the Himalayas, but the big ones are the ones that take up the strain. And these are the ones that we've got to be prepared for in the future. So a lot of these stories are in my book, which I can highly recommend if you haven't read it. And Nepal, as I say, is a fabulous country, fantastic mountains, wonderful scenery, great geology. and lovely people. It's also got amazing wildlife. It's very famous for langur monkeys, which I see round Pokhara. If you go down to the Chitwan in the south, it's famous for the Bengal tigers. And I've seen red pandas in the forests above Langtang as well, which is an absolutely magical sight. Chitwan, of course, is also famous for the great one-horned rhinos and musk deer, black bear, all sorts of fantastic wildlife down there. There's hundreds during the migration in the spring and autumn. There's flocks of thousands of bar-headed geese coming over from Tibet, and you'll hear them honking. They fly at altitudes above 10 kilometers as they traverse across the high Himalayas. In Mustang, we're bound to see some of these lammergeiers, bearded vultures, which are the desert vultures of Tibet. And the steppe eagles here are the commonest raptors. The monal pheasant is the most spectacular bird of all. This is the national bird of Nepal. The ibisbill we will see, they occur in these high altitude river valleys like we're going to see up in the Mustang region. And then down in the south, paradise flycatchers are unbelievable, golden orioles, and my favorite of all are the fantastic little sunbirds that you see all over the gardens of around Pokhara and the slopes of Nepal. So Nepal, I cannot emphasize enough what a wonderful country it is. And if you haven't been trekking there, it's one of those things that you must do in your life. So we will be continuing to run treks out to Nepal as long as the legs will stand, hopefully for a long time. And I urge you to come along with us and sign up. Okay, I'm going to hand over to David now to give you some insight into the culture. So I will stop screen sharing. But thank you for listening.
Right, hello everybody. I hope you can see my first slide. Yes, the earthquake was a great tragedy. It would have been much, much worse if it hadn't fortunately been happening, fortunately it was happening on a Saturday in the middle of the day. If it had happened at night, maybe 4 times as many people might have died. Most people were outside and it wasn't a school day, thank goodness. Anyway, one slight silver lining which came out of the earthquake was that Mike and I met. Mike had been going to Nepal since 1980 and I'd been going to Nepal since 1975. And we both loved the country. We were both professors at the University of Oxford and we had never met each other and didn't even know about each other's existence until the earthquake. And the earthquake brought us together and the rest is history, as they say. And now Mike talked me into leading an alumni tour, which is a first for me, but not for him. And so obviously I knew the reason I had not heard of Mike before is because I know absolutely nothing about rocks. And I'm hoping to become a little tiny bit knowledgeable anyway by the end of the tour. And so I'm going to be sort of doing like him, doing a kind of transept through Nepal. Nepal goes from the Indian plains in the south up to the Tibetan plateau. And so correspondingly, just as you get all these different kinds of rock, you also get all these different kinds of cultures. The one that I actually know and can sort of speak about with some expertise, so I'm going to talk about that most, is the culture of the Kathmandu Valley. That's where I lived for 2 years when I was doing my PhD in 1982 to 84. But we'll end with some of these fantastic pictures, courtesy of Sam Cowan of Mustang, and I hope anyway. Part of the idea of the tour is to experience not just the different sort of rock formations and so on, and the wonderful scenery, but also the different cultures and how they fit together or don't, as the case may be. So this first slide shows.
Can you just maximise your screen a second, because
not maximized.
Just make it big. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
I thought it was. Okay, hang on a second. Why is it not maximized? Is it? You are screen sharing.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. So this first slide, you've got the center of the city of Patan. So the Kathmandu Valley has 3 ancient cities, which are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. and we hopefully will have time to visit. We'll certainly visit 2 of the 3, and we'll stay in 2 of the 3 in the tour. And these are wonderful kind of medieval constructions with the royal palace at the center, surrounded by Hindu temples. And essentially, I mean, the cities themselves are over 1,000 years old, but what you see is essentially from the 17th and 18th centuries. And in the early 80s, when I was living there, the city of Patan had kind of rice fields on 2 sides. Sadly, that is no longer the case. So this is me in very first time in 1976 in Nepal. This is me doing fieldwork in 1983 with my good friend Tirtha, who's now a very rich man making and selling bricks. This is a photograph taken of me, unbeknownst to me, by a local photographer, and only somebody pointed out that it was in the window of the photography shop a couple of weeks later, doing the Mataya procession in 1983, which is a kind of all-day procession. You start at 5 in the morning and finish about 6 at night, visiting every single Buddhist chaitya in the city of Patan, and it's making offerings to every one of them. And this is my friend Bruce Owens, who is also an anthropologist, also doing fieldwork in Patan at the very same time. And the photographers caught that moment where Bruce is asking me, "What on earth am I doing doing this procession?" And here is this is a special feast that was for Tirtha's grandfather, going through a special old age ceremony, which you'll see some more pictures of in a minute. And I'm sitting next to Father John Locke, who wrote the key book on the history of Machendranath or Karanamaya, and these are the various relatives and friends of Tirtha. So this is the place where I focused my initial PhD research. It's called the Golden Temple, and it's got these fantastic sculptures, medieval sculptures which have got these metal bands around, of course, because they're terrified that somebody will steal them. And it's one of the most spectacular Buddhist sites in the city of Patan. And this is the farewell ceremony. When I left, I'd been living there for 19 months, so they felt they had to do something special. This was how I used to wash back in the early 80s. There was no shower inside the house, and this is a famous occasion in 1992 of a big conference on and our friend Nirmal, who was kind of a mentor to everybody who worked on the Newars of the Kathmandu Valley, got us all home to his house to have a special Newar feast. And here we are sitting in the specified traditional order that you should sit in a Newar feast, from most senior to most junior. So we've got Michael Allen, who wrote a famous book about the Kumari, the famous living goddess, Gerard Toffin, who's written more about Newars than anybody, some in English or in French. There's Bruce Owens, whom we saw earlier. The only non-Newar specialist, Chris McDonough, Declan Quigley, a good friend of mine who introduced me to the field. There's me, and then the Linda Iltis, of course. Traditional culture has slight sexism to it, I'm afraid, but that's the way things are. So I've been going back since the early 80s, almost every year, not necessarily every year. And I dedicated, apart from my parents and my wife, I also dedicated my first book to this lady, Jogmaya Sakya, because she was a pretty extraordinary woman and she's the only woman of her generation I have ever met who knew how to read and write. Well, maybe not to write, but she knew how to read, and she'd learned by copying her brother when he was being taught. And she's passed away now, of course, but I was very lucky that I was present at the time when she went through this special old age ceremony, which you do 3 times if you live long enough. The first time after you've lived for 1,000 months and so on, so which is 77 years, 7 months and 7 days. And the second time, I think, is when you're sort of 83 or something like that, and then 89 or something like that is for the third one. And she was too modest. She didn't want to do the first 2, but when she got to this grand old age and was the oldest person in the entire neighborhood, the family insisted they had to do the ritual. So this is all of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered together in the Golden Temple. And she lives, and she was like a kind of substitute mother to me when I was doing my field work. And she was also very knowledgeable about her own culture. And I learned an awful lot from her. And I remember about 8 months or maybe a year into kind of living in her house, she finally said, "David, you know what? I finally understood what it is you're here to learn, and what you're trying to say." She was a great help to me in my field work. So Sylvain Lévy, the great French Sanskritist and sinologist, famously said, Nepal is India in the making. Le Nepal, c'est l'Inde qui se fait. And what he meant by that, and because by Nepal, what he meant was the Kathmandu Valley, because the word Nepal originally applied to the Kathmandu Valley only. And even today, in some remote areas of the hills, you will find Nepalis will say to you, oh, my Nepal Jani, I'm going off to Nepal. And what they mean is I'm going to Kathmandu. And it was only later, first the British, and only much later the Nepalis themselves extended the name of the valley to the country as a whole. Now, what did Sylvain Lévy mean when he said Nepal is India in the making? What he meant was that if you go to the Kathmandu Valley, you can grasp the whole history of South Asia, by which, how was it that, a small number of invaders coming into South Asia from the Northwest were able to impart their culture and above all their language, so that 2/3 of South Asia now speak Indo-European languages. How was that possible? And Nepal helps you to understand that to some extent. So what you've got in the Kathmandu Valley is, according to him, and my work essentially builds on that presupposition, is that the Kathmandu Valley is a kind of time machine, in that you can there are many things about the Newar culture of the Kathmandu Valley which preserve those patterns which existed 1,000 years ago in North India and have simply have been changed or destroyed or disappeared. And one of the key thing is the coexistence of Buddhism and Hinduism. But I've listed them here on the slide. The first thing, Indrajatra, the Hindu god Indra, is hardly worshipped in India anymore. It's a name, it might occur in liturgies, but there's no actual festivals or shrines to him. In Nepal, they still have a special festival for Indra every year. Buddhism, the coexistence of Buddhism and Hinduism. So you have, Newars are both Hindu and Buddhist. Some are more Hindu, some are more Buddhist, and some are both. The famous joke is the foreigner asks the Newar, are you a Hindu or Buddhist? And the Newar says, yes. And the foreigner writes in their notebook, this Newar is deeply confused, but actually it's the foreigner who's confused and is misusing the word or. So anyway, coexistence of Buddhism and Hinduism. Third thing, which is really archaic about Newar culture, is that Newar women do not put a fuli or a nose ornament in their noses. So a few have now started to do that, but it's a very traditional Newar thing that Newars don't wear nose ornaments. That's something which came in after the arrival of the Muslims and Muslim dominance of North India from about 1100, 1200 onwards. And it's not only Buddhism. The forms of Hinduism, there are many modern forms of Hinduism that are now very influential, but the forms of Hinduism that are preserved, particularly in Bhaktapur, are old Tantric forms of Hinduism that were much more prevalent 1,000 years ago. And some of the architectural scenes that you can see, this is actually from Angkor Wat, and this is a chaitya from Nepal, very similar in many ways. So as I say, and similar, you can see similar kind of, this is a very similar shape of stupa, old shape of stupa. And one of the wonderful things about these medieval cities is, you walk around and you see these amazing, 10th century sculptures in the street. Not all of them have been stolen. Some are being returned now, even kept turning up in Western museums or art houses and being returned. And so this is a typical, the Newar Buddhist Monastery, has three core elements. It has the central shrine to the Buddha, usually. It has at least one chaitya out front, but these are various other things that local members have offered, including here we've got the symbol of Tantrism, the Vajra. And then up here, behind this window, you've got the secret Tantric shrine. And in the doorway, you have something which is certainly, it's described by the Chinese pilgrims who visited North India in 800, 700, 900 of the Common Era. You have at the entrance door guardian Mahakala, Buddhist version of Bhairava, if you like. Here also Ganesh, the god of good luck. And the members of the Sakya and Vajracharya caste of the Newars have to become monks. They are kind of married monks, if you like. So they go through this ritual that they go through of becoming a monk as a boy for 4 days. The liturgy and the symbolism and the ritual of it reproduces patterns that go right back to the beginning of Buddhism. It also incorporates various kind of tantric elements. Here you've got the priest whispering a mantra into the boy's ear. Obviously that wouldn't have happened 2,000 years ago, but so it's the monastic idea, if you like, is encapsulated within a tantric framework. So this is my model, if you like, of Newa Buddhism. It starts with the monastic idea, then you move to becoming a household, and finally you take initiation and become an advanced practitioner of the tantric path. And this photograph was not taken by me. This was taken by a friend, because I'm not allowed to go into this room. This is for members only, and usually it's only for people who've taken tantric initiation inside the Golden Temple. And these are the elders of the monastery. You can see somebody must have been sick here, so there's a gap in the order of seniority. And this is the Newa caste system. So they have about 20 castes, as you would indeed find in the plains of North India, but not in the kind of more rustic, simplified caste system of the Nepalese hills, with Brahmins and kind of, if you like, the Buddhist equivalent of Brahmins, the Buddhist priests, Vajracharyas and Sakyas here, high caste Hindus, but also some of whom are also Buddhist. The biggest caste here, the agriculturalists, various artisans, and then what would nowadays be called Dalits, the untouchables at the bottom. And these maps were produced by the German architect Niels Gutshoff, and this shows the pattern. If you can see, it's laid out on a grid, deliberately laid out according to the Hindu Vastu Shastras. This is the old ancient medieval city of Patan, and he shows his research cleverly showed how this gully, this lane, didn't fit the pattern, and that was the kind of original lane which around which the city coalesced. And in the oldest parts of these cities are these old water spouts, and the Newas used to have this incredible technological engineering skill. They could bring water from several miles away underground, and the water was always very pure. And you saw that picture of me bathing in one of them a long time ago. This is a map showing how the history has changed. You've got the 4 Ashoka Stupas at the 4 corners of the city, and this is just to demonstrate that at one time the center of the city was here, and in the Mulla reconstruction, which created that grid pattern, the palace was put here, and so it was moved 1 block diagonally to the south. And this again is another very archaic feature. It only happens in, it mainly happens in Patan. This is every 5 years they have this big festival, which is again described happening by the great Emperor Harsha in first millennium North India. Where the Buddhists, they bring out these huge Dipankara statues, and essentially what the Buddhists are doing by participating in this festival is saying, I'm going to be a future Buddha. It was in the time of the previous Buddha Dipankara that the Buddha of our age, Siddhartha, took the vow to become a Buddha in order to save humankind. So that kind of vow, if you like, is reenacted every 5 years in this big festival. And this is, again, these are pictures from the 80s showing this is the Everest Hotel on the way to the airport. This whole area is now built up with houses, I'm sad to say. There's a very rich ritual life based around these associations called Gutis, and these are from 3 different neighborhoods. They come for a whole month. They go walk early in the morning to Swayambhu, recite Buddhist hymns, and this is a kind of harvest festival, if you like. They with various grains, they create these symbolic Buddhist patterns. Migration, as we know, with globalization, Nepalis are now found everywhere. So Newas are actually found, there are probably about maybe 10,000, between 5 and 10,000 Newas. There's probably nearly 100,000 Nepalis in this country now. These are actually all Newa girls living in London, in southeast London, but they're dressed up as different ethnic groups and singing while everybody sings the national anthem. So this is the kind of annual big Newa festival of Mal Puja back in 2009. So as we move out of the valley, we move into a kind of different cultural world. The villages are simpler, but it's not, from a religious or cosmology point of view, it's still incredibly complicated. It's still very many rituals. Mike already showed a picture this is a view from Sarankot of the northern extension now of Pokhara. This is a view from Bandipur, and the tour, one of the places we'll stay overnight is Bandipur, which is an old Newa town, which has been preserved because it was on a hill. So it was a Newa trading town. The traders all moved out with the coming of the roads, but they kept their houses, and it's now been reinvented, if you like, as a tourist destination. So that's why it's a bit like somewhere like Bruges, if you like, which has been bypassed by modernity. And Mike's already shown you this picture, this photograph of Gandruk, which is a famous Gurung village. So Gurung ethnic group, they are a Tibeto-Burman speaking group. So they don't speak the Tibetan dialect, but they do speak a Tibeto-Burman language, still tonal. There are now many, the Gurungs actually are the largest group among the diaspora population in this country, because they were in the Gurkhas. And these are three famous. This is old Gampokara, which taken back in 1976. This is the village of Siklis, another famous, right high up under Annapurna. And this picture here and this one here is the annual New Year Losar celebration, Gurung Losar celebration, as in this country, in Surrey. And this chap here is a famous shaman, Poju Yarjung, who was in the Gurkhas, now lives in Ely. And his services are much in demand. I think he only agrees very little to actually do them, but his life work is the translation of the shamanic trance, the writing down and preservation of the shamanic trance in written form. And here's the Nepalese ambassador releasing one of those written forms. Okay, we're nearly at the end now. So we go up the Tak Kola. Here are pictures courtesy of Sam Cowan. So the first way we'll go to Muktinat. Muktinat is where, if you like, the two worlds collide, the world of the south and the world of the north. So it's equally sacred to Buddhists and Hindus. It's Avalokiteshvara for Buddhists. It's Vishnu for Hindus. Prime Minister Modi from India flew up there by helicopter in part of his visiting pilgrimage sites in Nepal. But it's also where Tibet, if you like, the world of Tibet. And we've seen this photograph already. This is looking south, actually. You come up the valley. We've got the Tibetan plateau is behind us to the north, and we're entering already a very different cultural world. You can see also the roofs are all flat because there's hardly any rain, and you've got the kind of the barley fields here. Here is the barley harvest in Sarang, and this is our destination, if you like, Lomantan, a little piece of Tibet which survived as a kingdom, separate kingdom. It's still, although formally it's now properly incorporated into the current governance structures of Nepal, for a very long time it was incorporated into Greater Nepal, as it were, in the end of the 18th century. But the king was allowed a considerable degree of autonomy right up until the end of the 20th century. So it's still quite distinct, and you have to get a separate permit to visit. So it's preserved quite a lot of Tibetan culture or Tibetan style culture. Like, although of course, with the migration that I said, there's an awful lot of people from Lomantan are actually right now living in New York. Okay, I think that's the last slide. Yes, so we're ready to now move to the Q&A. So let me stop sharing. And I see we've got 12 minutes to take questions.
We have one question here from Elizabeth Fleet. She's asking, how old are the boys when they become monks? How are they chosen as monks?
Well, all the boys from Shakya and Vajracharya families have to go through their kind of, if you like, caste initiation ritual, and it has to be in an odd number of years. So probably 5 would be the youngest, and 13 or 13 would be normally the oldest. But I've seen when boys have come back from abroad or been, for some whatever reason, been outside the valley for some reason, they, you can be any age. You have to be unmarried. So, but as long as it's in an odd numbered year, then you're fine.
All right, and we have one more question from John Lipsy, who asks, when is the next 5-year festival?
I think it's usually sometime around February, and I think it was already this year. So the next one would be in 2025, counting inclusively. So I think it's 2025 will be the next one.
Great. Michael Bloom asks, what causes the sacred burning water in Muktinat? And he says he went there in 1981 on the Annapurna circuit.
Well, that's a question for Mike. I think it's gas, isn't it? Gas emissions.
Yeah, it's natural gas seepage, actually, from the Tethian shelf carbonate. And it comes up in the middle of the monastery in Muktinat, which is quite an extraordinary sight. It's a bit like the natural gas fields that you see in Azerbaijan that are burning continuously.
Fantastic.
There are also hot springs for the same reason, right? Or similar reason.
No, the gas is from a sort of petroleum-based carbonate, whereas the hot springs are just water circulating around and they come up big faults.
Okay.
Everywhere along the main central thrust, for example, there's hot springs. Tatopani is in every valley in Nepal, hot springs, and you can almost map the main central thrust by joining up the dots between the Tatopanis.
Great. We have another question from Michael Bloom. He asks, David, was your picture of the Patan temples taken before or after the earthquake?
I'm not sure which one, but the main one from the first slide, definitely before, I think. Yeah. Yeah, I think it pretty much before. But I have to check that.
We have one question from an anonymous attendee who says, did the arrival of the Muslims influence the Buddhist Hindu practices or architecture?
Did there other? I mean, that's such a big question. I mean, it's about the whole history of religion in South Asia. And, yeah, I mean, all kinds of, new forms of religion emerged, which were influenced by Islam. So, more monotheistic. Sikhism, obviously. Sikhism is clearly rose as a kind of, by influence. And then, so those kind of couple of temples that the Sikhs have and that sometimes Hindus use, obviously, is partly, there was a kind of joint culture emerged.
Fantastic. A question for Mike from Deborah Rees. She's asking, I understand that since the earthquake, you have raised funds to help villagers who lost much. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, sure. Well, I've been working in Nepal for many years, and I've always taken people from the village of Yarsa, which is near Kashigaon. It's on the opposite side of the Buri Gandaki from the villages that were totally flattened, Laprak and Barpak. And when I went up there eventually about 6 months after the earthquake, half the houses in the village had collapsed. But to cut a long story short, I started fundraising for the village, and we ended up raising about £40,000, mostly from just local people around Oxford and the Sherpa communities in Reading. And we managed to rebuild the houses. We built a brand new school for 180 kids, which is a great success. And we've also just completed building a small village hospital, which I'm happy to say that our Siddhar has just had the birth of his 4th child in our hospital, which is great. And we're now putting in a plumbing system to get piped water to all the houses. So I think a lot of people go to Nepal trekking, and it's just so nice to give something back to the people because they are incredibly hardworking. Their only income is really sending young men out to the Middle East building sites, and they really do have a short straw in life. So a lot of the villages are almost deserted now of young men. They're all in the Middle East or Malaysia, and but hopefully, with the trekking jobs and things, that will change, and a lot of people are now coming back from sites like in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and actually going back to their villages and starting a perfectly normal life. So
fantastic. Carol Williams asks, what sort of gradients do the treks follow?
Well, it depends where you're going. Kaligandaki is pretty flat all the way up to at least to Kagbeni. The Modi Kola is the opposite. You're treading steps all the way up. It's like climbing upstairs for about a week solidly. So every valley is different.
Great. Chris Robinson, I beg your pardon, asks, have you ever glimpsed the elusive snow leopard?
I have. After 30 years of going to the Himalayas, I was camped at the top of the Langtang Valley, and a friend of mine from Canada was out with me, and he came to my tent and said, do you have big cats in Nepal? So I leapt out and said, yes, where? And right up on the cliff was this absolutely magnificent snow leopard, and it had chased a blue sheep down to a little cliff ledge, and it just sat there for about 15 minutes watching this barrel and then eventually gave up and slunk off. But they are the most magnificent animals on the planet. And they're actually very common. They're very common in Ladakh. Marka Valley has several of them that come down to the villages every day. And they're common in all the way across. In the Hindu Kush in Pakistan, they're very common. And in parts of southern Tibet, they're common as well. But they are just absolutely gorgeous animals.
Fantastic. John Nutt asks, are you expecting the next big earthquake within 100 years? And will latest instrumentation be able to give any advance warning?
That's a very interesting question. There is instrumentation all over Tibet, all over Nepal and Tibet in the form of GPS, which records surface motions. So we know with a very high degree of certainty that the convergence between India and Asia is ongoing. We can build up an Earth from micro earthquakes and seismic details underneath the Himalayas. We can build up a pretty good picture of where the major faults are that are going to break. But the one thing we cannot do is to say when. So we know where the earthquake is likely to go off. And in central Nepal, that region is the mountains south of Kathmandu towards Chitwan, and the region to the west of Pokhara, to the west of Gorkha, which includes the Pokhara region. Those are areas in which the strain, as we know, is built up and has not been released by one of these big earthquakes. So it's certainly going to happen, but we just don't know when.
That's fantastic. I think we've got time for just a couple more. We have Francesca Vogels asking, how fit would I need to be to spend a week with you both?
Well, I mean, this particular trip that we're going to take this year is not very demanding. I mean, with this 1 day, 2 days, maybe 3 of full walking, and the rest of the time fairly gentle walking. And anybody who actually was totally incapacitated or couldn't manage a full day's walk would be able to go with the jeeps, right? So, but having said that, if you want to take full advantage of it, you should be capable of walking for 8 hours, I suppose. But we're not going straight up. There's no 8 hours straight up or anything like that. And it's not through Scottish bogs or and hopefully the weather will be extremely clement. But windy, but it will be windy, right, Mike? I mean, coming down, I think there's a big wind that comes down.
Yeah, all these big Himalayan valleys have katabatic winds, which come down from the temperature difference between the upland plateaus, which heat up during the day. So the Gandaki around Jomasam, Kagbeni, you get these hurricane force winds coming down, which are dry, very dry, and you literally have to wrap your face in a kafia or a headscarf to protect it. They can be pretty vicious.
Fantastic. Robert Johnson asks, what would have been the timescale for the emptying of Muktinat Lake?
Oh, well, I'm guessing, but the emptying of the Seti Kola, which was basically 1 day of build-up in that dam that came down off the landslide of Annapurna 4, that created an incredible amount of damage all the way down to Pokhara. And I think once that was breached, that lake would have drained out instantly, a day or two to drain the whole thing. In Western Tibet, there's an even bigger lake where the upper reaches of the Sutlej come in. This is just the region to the south of Mount Kailas. There's an enormous lake sediment up there, very similar to the Low Mantang rocks, that is about 700 kilometers east-west and about 20 kilometers north-south. And exactly the same thing. At some stage, an earthquake in the upper Sutlej broke that and the whole lake drained out. And it was one of these floods that caused the devastation of Alexander the Great's army. So they've happened through historic time. And what's left is the geological remnants of that lake. So we can actually date the bottom of the lake sediments. It's pretty tricky, but you can do it. And you can calculate the amount of lake water that was in that lake. And it's pretty incredible, really, how much volume of material is coming down those rivers. I mean, the Gandaki, that lake, when it drained out of Mustang, was probably halfway up to the summit of Dhaulagiri.
Wow. So an awful lot of animals must have been killed in that.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We've had a lot of questions. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get any more in now. It's already 8 o'clock and that was our time slot. So
yeah, so I think it's time now to say thank you very much to Mike and David for a fantastic presentation, and I hope you all enjoyed it. As I said at the beginning, keep your eyes peeled for more upcoming armchair travel events, because they do seem to be really popular, and we would like to thank you all for attending this evening as well. So thank you very much all, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Goodbye. Yeah. See you, Mike.
Right, I'm still here. You're still here.
Yeah. Okay, well,
Good.
see you down the pub.
Yes, okay. Kate's gone, has she? Everyone?
Yeah, Asia, you just need to press the end meeting now.
sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.